Hello, my name is Dr. Andrew Matamoros, and welcome to today's online lecture covering inflammatory bowel diseases. More specifically, we will be going over ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. Now, before we go over these diseases, I want to review the gastrointestinal tract. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the evolution of the gastrointestinal tract and just how much it's increased in complexity. For this example, we see here a hydra, and inside the hydra we can see a water flea, also known as a daphnia. Now, this hydra has a mouth and tentacles that helps it capture the food, and then lining the gastrovascular cavity of the hydra, we can see a special group of cells, these epithelial cells. And over here we can see the step-by-step process of digestion. First, digestive enzymes are going to be released by gland cells. And as these digestive enzymes are released here in this purple color, we can see they're engulfing the soft tissue of the water flea, and they are going to enzymatically digest it. Then these food particles are able to be endocytosed by cells and brought into the cytosol, where then the food particles are digested in what are called food vacuoles. Now, over time, this process has added some steps. We can see that with something like an earthworm, grasshopper, and even a bird, we have an increase in complexity as well as size. So in the earthworm, we still see that we have the mouth, as well as the grasshopper and our bird. But now we see that we have an esophagus, as well as the crop and gizzard. We can see the crop and the esophagus are still here in the grasshopper, as well as in the bird, which also includes a gizzard. The gizzard is an interesting organ because this is going to replace teeth for these organisms. So for us humans and mammals, we have teeth to chew or mechanically digest our food. But in the earthworm and the bird, they have a gizzard, which are going to contain stones and rocks and debris that will then aid in mechanically digesting that food. We can also see they have an intestine and an anus, as well as the grasshopper and, again, the bird. Now for humans, we see that our mouth, again, a difference from these guys, we don't have a gizzard, we have teeth. And the teeth, along with the tongue, are going to be used to mechanically digest our food, break it down, where it's then swallowed down our long esophagus. It enters our stomach that has gastric juices for chemical digestion, as well as protein enzymes. And then we'll see it enter into our small intestine, which has many microvilli, which we'll review. We'll even see a picture of that from a very special pill camera that people can swallow to then take pictures of your insides. And this is where a majority of the absorption takes place from food. Then it will enter into large intestine, where we have a large variety of bacteria. And we're going to spend some time today learning about the microbiome and just how important that is to the diseases that we'll be covering for IBD, as well as the rectum and anus. All right. So now we're going to shift into talking about what the stages of food processing are. So the first stage is going to be ingestion, or simply put, just eating. The second stage of food processing will be digestion. This is actually going to occur in two phases. So first, that food is going to be mechanically broken down by the teeth in our mouth into these very small pieces. So we're going to use this little kitten as an example. We'll see that the reason we're going to chew food is because we need to break it down into small pieces to increase the available surface area. And that's going to allow for all the chemical processes that are going to aid in digestion and breakdown of food particles. It'll help that process speed up. Second, we see that food is going to be chemically broken down by specific enzymes. So not only will we have gastric juices that are very acidic and will work to just chemically break down the food, there will also be proteins, more specifically enzymes, that will be used to break down that food enzymatically through a process known as hydrolysis. So if we go back up to our adorable little kitten here, we'll see how we get to this hydrolysis is first we have to break this food up. So again, if this kitten were to just swallow one of these cubes of food whole, then we imagine it won't be in pieces. It'll just be one bulky cube. So that when it got to the stomach for chemical digestion and enzymatic digestion via hydrolysis, we would find that it would have to attack that cube from all the different surfaces that were exposed. So that would make it a lot more slow compared to a process where the food was broken up into little pieces, where the chemical could get at it from many different surfaces rather than just the ones shown here when the food is solid. I go into great lengths to discuss this because, in fact, breaking up this food is really important. We kind of take chewing for granted, I think, because it's a very, very key part in our digestive process. We need these to become very small molecules once they hit our intestines so that they can be absorbed back into the body, and that the undigested material will mostly contain material that we could not take up. And so returning to our list of digestive processes, we can see that animals cannot directly use proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and nucleic acids in foods because they're too big. All right, they're going to be too large, and so they won't be able to pass through the cell membranes for absorption, and that's why we need this mechanical and chemical digestion. So there's going to be multiple components that go into that gastric juice I mentioned in the stomach. We'll see that we have the protein digesting enzymes. We then have mucus that helps to protect the lining of the stomach from these digestive enzymes, as well as the strong acids. So again, the lining in the stomach is actually at risk, and that's why we need this mucosal layer. And that risk is mitigated in part by the mucus, as well as a constant turnover of stomach cells. We're constantly refreshing the lining of our stomach as a result of these two very damaging chemicals and enzymes. Now, an advantage to having this highly acidic juice in the stomach is that we're going to be able to break apart cells in the food and denature proteins, and we'll also be able to dissolve bacteria and microbes. So we're going to go over how we do have bacteria lining our intestinal tract, but there's a lot of other kinds of bacteria out there, some of which we've covered in this class, that we don't want anywhere in our body. And so this is a great defense mechanism to get rid of that, to have such a harsh environment as a first pass in our digestive process. And before we move on from the stomach, it's important to point out that the stomach can also suffer from a condition known as gastritis, which is where the lining of the stomach becomes inflamed. And that is usually going to be caused by some sort of bacteria. It's called H. pylori, and that will lead to ulcers. So this is probably something that you guys have heard of. And so here we see again the stomach as an example of a cell surface that is susceptible to bacteria and inflammation. Our next stop is the small intestine. It's also the first stop in today's discussion on inflammatory bowel diseases. So while the stomach and esophagus and even the mouth to some extent can be affected, we're going to find that it's mainly the small intestine and large intestine where these symptoms occur. So for the first stop here, we see with the small intestine, it's still the primary organ for chemical digestion, but we also see that now it's the first time we're going to be absorbing the nutrients from the food that's been taken in. And so we have this thought question down here. What is it about the considerable length that's going to help carry out that second function, the absorption of nutrients? And what I want you guys to think about is how the longer the small intestine is, the more area there is for nutrients to be absorbed. Okay, and we're going to see in a moment too that to expand on that surface area even more, the epithelial cells have arranged themselves into villi. And then on the tops of those cells that make up that villi, we're going to find that there's even smaller microvilli. And so let's look at what that looks like. So here on the left is the cartoon depiction of a small intestine. We can see it's highly vascularized because this is where we're going to be absorbing nutrients into. This is why we eat. We want to get those nutrients back into our bloodstream so they can supply all the tissues of our body. And so we can see here with these large circular folds that we are going to now increase surface area as we zoom in. All right, so not only do we increase it by having the larger fold, but within those folds we'll see that there's these villi. And these villi have much space between them that allows for an even further expansion of surface area. And then, if we zoom in even more and increase this magnification, we appreciate that the cells lining these villi have microvilli. All right, so we're really just seeing this expansion of surface area through these villi. And we can see that what's depicted here is that nutrients will be absorbed into these cells. So it's this moment where the actual absorption takes place all along the surface here in this small intestine, where it then enters the blood or lymph. So we can supply our cells with the necessary nutrients from the food we've consumed. Now here we can see a pill that can be swallowed that has a camera attached to it that will allow doctors to visualize the inside of your small intestine. And so this is going to be important because as we can see here, the villi that we see lining this tissue, this is all sensitive tissue that can become inflamed in inflammatory bowel diseases. Next, we move to the large intestine, where the major function is to absorb water. Now, the large intestine is going to be a region that is highly affected by inflammatory bowel disease. One of the reasons is because this is where we're going to find a large amount of bacteria. In fact, this bacteria is good, is aiding our body in digesting otherwise indigestible food materials, and they also produce important vitamins. So we get nutrients from the work that is being done by the bacteria in our large intestine. Now, we'll see in a little bit that that bacteria has good players and bad players. And if the bad players are to win out, then that's where we'll see the emergence of inflammation and ultimately inflammatory bowel disease. Now we're going to move into the diseases that we're covering today. And it's important that we first start off with a difference between two different bowel-related problems, medical issues, if you will. So here we see irritable bowel syndrome versus inflammatory bowel diseases. Now, the difference between IBS and IBD aren't very apparent at first. It's understandable that many people would confuse these two. But I think right here we can just kind of get at the differences. So we see it to the left with IBS, we do have functional GI disorders, although they're not life-threatening. This can be caused by many different things. There's no real known genetic component at this time, and it's extremely common. In fact, it has become even more common, especially in Western cultures, and it's often treated with lifestyle changes. Now, on the other side of this Venn diagram, we can see that for inflammatory bowel disease, we have chronic inflammation. It's going to be life-threatening for some. It's mainly caused by inflammation, and there is a genetic component. It is also less common, although there are a large number of Americans. We'll see in a moment. I believe the number is around 3 million, and this is going to be treated with a surgery. It's actually surprisingly common. Again, we'll see in a moment some numbers of just how common that is. Now here I have a little joke. So doing this online, I don't have the benefit of trying to get some laughs out of you in a classroom, and I don't have a laugh track for this, but what we see here is just essentially that Batman is correcting Robin because he has started to call this irritable bowel, but Batman says, no, Robin, it is inflammatory bowel disease with a swift slap of the face there. So a little aggressive, but I think what we are appreciating from this meme that was actually taken from a Twitter account for inflammatory bowel disease is this is a very uncomfortable thing to live with. While yes, irritable bowel syndrome is terrible, inflammatory bowel disease is going to lead to some surgeries that are going to be very, very life altering. So I think that's where some of this aggression comes from comparing IBS to IBD. Let's first discuss Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel disease that largely affects the small intestine. This is due to chronic inflammation of the digestive tract, and in this image we can actually see in color different regions of the gastrointestinal tract that can become affected by Crohn's disease. However, it's important to note that it's largely the intestines, particularly the small intestine, where we see Crohn's disease develop. And in this image to the top left, what we're looking at here are inflammatory polyps. These are zones of inflammation where the tissue has swelled. Now on the right, we see ulcerative colitis. Right away, we can see that from the images of an endoscopy that the surface topography is different. Here we can see it's more of a rash, whereas for Crohn's disease, it had these polyps. Now, in this image, we'll notice that it is only the large intestine that has been colored, and we can see that specifically the small bowel is actually left out. So now, with ulcerative colitis, we're focused more on the large intestine. This is where chronic inflammation is going to cause the sores and ulcers, and can even affect the rectum. All right, and so now the next part of the story is reviewing or appreciating the role that the immune system plays in inflammatory bowel diseases. It's what puts the inflammation in IBD. So here we can see the cells of the immune system. This is pretty small text, obviously, because I don't want you to memorize this. This isn't something I want you to necessarily pay too much attention to. It's the finer points. Really just appreciate that we have a plethora of immune cells that all perform different functions. But for the purpose of this class, we're focused mainly on the disease as a whole. So we're not going to dig too far into the immune system. We could spend a lot of time on this. We could spend a whole unit on just immunity. We could spend a semester on it. But we're just going to talk about it in reference to diseases. And so actually we've already done that before. So down here, this cartoon of generating super soldiers, we learned about CAR T cells. So these were those special cells that we were going to take out of cancer patients, re-engineer and arm them to be able to uniquely identify cancer. Remember, we did that with viruses. So we used a virus to re-engineer these cells. And that was using a T cell, which is an immune cell, and that's what made it capable of killing cancer cells, because that's sort of the job of the immune system, is to regulate and patrol the body. And that's why we have this sort of funny cartoon here. And if you spend some time looking at this long enough, you actually do appreciate this is somewhat accurate. For example, the B cell, he kind of looks like a James Bond assassin type character with the bow tie and then this pistol. And you see antibodies coming off, and that's because the B cells are going to be largely responsible for creating very specific and assassin-like antibodies that can select very specific targets. Whereas we have something more like a macrophage that I think is being depicted as almost like a toddler, kind of playing around on a toy and drooling and just running around. Macrophages can be pretty lethal. They can really damage tissue, even healthy tissue. And so what we're kind of appreciating here is we have this array of cells in the immune system that are going to be used to patrol and regulate the invaders and bacteria in our body. But they are also going to be regulating the process of inflammation. And so in inflammatory bowel diseases, we see that host genetics are going to play a part. Okay, there'll be some susceptibility that will be granted because of some genetic mutations. And these could give rise to barrier function degradation, meaning that the epithelium of the intestine is compromised and so it can become inflamed. Then we also see a dysregulated immune response. So maybe they just have an overactive immune response and may recognize healthy cells, target things it shouldn't, or maybe bacteria sort of set it off into a hypervigilant state that almost overreacts and can damage healthy tissue. And this can lead to IBD. Now, we can also have on the other side of this, just we don't want to just focus on genetics. We also have environmental factors. So we can have these pathogens, antibiotics can cause this, diet, and stress. These two are a little controversial, but we'll see that there are some studies that link this to that, as reported by the NIH. And so again, what we're appreciating here is that this immune response that we're talking about and this compromised barrier function, that's where our immune cells are going to now come in. Once we start to have these environmental factors and host genetics play a part to dysregulate our immune system or activate it or compromise the tissue, then our immune system is going to jump into action and they're going to look for something to do, something to fix. And so that's what's diagrammed here. So again, this is a lot to take in. I know the scope of this class is not molecular biology, so we are not going to cover this extensively. However, we're just going to appreciate what's going on here. Because in fact, you guys have seen some of this before. So you've seen these interleukin molecules. We've seen IFNs. TGF beta should feel somewhat, or at least TNF alpha should feel somewhat familiar. But these are immune molecules or cytokines. And what they're going to do is act as messengers in ways that different immune cells are able to coordinate a response and mount an effort to battle some sort of pathogenic bacteria. And so in this example, we see from this website, immunology.org, sort of trying to show how inflammatory bowel disease may be triggered. A pathogenic bacteria may have won out in the small intestine or large intestine. They get in there and they start to damage these cells. And once this bacteria damages the cells, or if the junctions between these cells are compromised, that's what we mean partly by this barrier function, then they're going to sneak past this system and also activate the immune system. So all of that could lead to a cascade that could trigger inflammatory bowel disease. And again, it's going to be these guys that now would become the bad guy. What's the bacteria doing here? I keep talking about bacteria in our intestine. Let's spend some time understanding this. So there are actually an enormous number of prokaryotes that are normally found within the large intestine. And these are going to include bacteria such as E. coli. And they're going to be used to produce things like vitamins. And so this bacteria residing in here, and here we can see some bacteria being stained, uh, it's just a fascinating and emerging field of research. It's very, very, very cutting edge stuff here. And in fact, what we're looking at in this slide is research suggesting that there may even be a link between high blood pressure and depression with the bacteria in our gut. And in fact, what we're looking at here is this sort of circuit. The idea that the brain, things like stress, depression, can regulate our blood pressure. And then we're going to see that ultimately that hypertension is going to impact the microbiome and vice versa. And we're not going to dig too much into this, but I'm just introducing this to you because really there is a plethora of research out there that's fascinating. So here we can see a man's gut bacteria was making him drunk in an extremely rare medical case. So the gut bacteria was actually, they had a very, very rare bacteria type that was creating ethanol. So a byproduct of this bacteria was an alcohol that was making this man highly intoxicated and was actually life-threatening. So while maybe it gets a little chuckle there, definitely not something you would want to have happen to you. And then we see here a mouse's metabolism may follow circadian rhythms set by gut bacteria. Do gut bacteria affect bowel cancer development? And also that cesarean babies have different gut bacteria microbiome study finds. So we'll see how a baby's delivered can impact the type of bacteria that you find in the intestine. So really, I'll also just make a note. These timestamps are old. This is a slide from a lecture I gave about a year ago. So it's now 2020. So this is, a much longer, at least a year ago. All right. So this one is where I may gross some of you out, but this is a really, really fascinating stuff. So we're actually, this will be one of our assignments covering the microbiome that I'll have you guys write a one-page review on. But what we see here is that antibiotics, genetics, diet, environmental factors, these things can impact the flora of bacteria that you find in the large intestine. And what can happen is that there is a constant battle going on where you have good bacteria and bad bacteria. One of those bad bacteria is this C. difficile, and what's going to happen here is as C. diff takes over, you are going to get inflammation. All right, it's a very, very horrible thing to have happen. And what we're finding is that if you were to take the feces from a healthy donor and transplant that into the large intestine. They do this essentially via a colonoscopy, and you then are able to repopulate this large intestine with healthy bacteria. And the idea is that that actually will help treat the C. diff infection. This is just absolutely fascinating stuff because if you think about inflammatory bowel diseases as a whole, um, fecal transplant may actually be a promising future. And we don't always have to have this be a fecal transplant. The hope is that in time we'll be able to identify just exactly what bacteria are so beneficial so that then we could maybe make something um, that's not someone else's feces. All right, and so to wrap up this microbiome topic, I just sort of showed you guys just how new this field is, and oftentimes when you have a new field of science, you'll have a whole bunch of, dare I say, pseudoscience that can follow with that. And so you'll see here people are selling you probiotics, different cultures that are going to change your life and shed pounds and treat depression and this and that, renew your life, the ultimate flora. All of this, let's take this with a grain of salt. All right, and there's an article here from Scientific American that you could read that will go over this. It essentially poses this question: do probiotics really work? So I just got done telling you about a fecal transplant. Now, I'm sitting here telling you that these probiotics are rubbish. Essentially, the point here is that we just need more research. And so I would definitely advise people to hold off on getting too excited about these over-the-counter probiotics. And definitely wait for something a little more serious and like we've learned in this class, FDA approved. And one more thing, one more topic about this microbiome to shift back to the inflammatory bowel diseases is to remind everybody that we are covered in bacteria. Not just on the inside, but also on the outside. So essentially what you're looking at here are how parts of the outside of our body can harbor these microorganisms. So sebaceous or oily glands, places where you'll find oil on the human body, moist parts of the body, and then dry parts of the body. Maybe somewhere where you're sweating versus, maybe a part of your forearm or some part of your body is going to be more dry. Look at this. So what we're looking at here in these graphs are all different types of bacteria. And notice that where bacterial samples were taken, we have very different microbiomes. So really what I want you guys to appreciate here is that our skin, our mouth, our nasal passage, and then yes, our digestive as well as your genital tracts have a plethora of bacteria. And so it's not all bad. There's good bacteria. And that's really the driving point here, that maybe we could find which bacteria are beneficial for our digestive system. And it could be used to treat inflammatory bowel disease. In fact, there is the Human Microbiome Project. So very similar to the Human Genome Project, there are a large number of scientists that are working to map all this bacteria in the human body. So that's actually what this pie chart is. You can see all the different portions of our body that house bacteria, and you'll actually see that the GI tract it wins out, right? It has the most bacteria, 29%. So there is a load of bacteria that's in our GI system. And if you start to read these headlines that are actually headlines from HMP, you'll see that we have had some really cool advances in our understanding of the microbiome in recent years. So we see that there's actually dramatic fluctuations in gut microbiome in individuals that have IBD. Also, different treatments for Crohn's disease in pediatric patients actually have distinct effects on the gut microbiome. So they change the gut microbiome profile that you see. So if we can start to understand which profiles have better outcomes, then maybe we can tailor treatments. We can also see here that the genome sequence of certain types of bacterium were analyzed, and it seems as though they can actually influence a host's weight. So this is where you may have heard in the news that there's a link between our microbiome in our intestines and obesity. I already mentioned the link to circadian rhythms. This involves our sleep-wake cycles, but we'll also see that there's just a large amount of diversity. And I also thought this last one was really interesting in that it can also be very lethal for infants, that they can develop sepsis from an improper balance of gut microbes. So we see that we're at a young age, humans are actually very sensitive to the types of flora, microbiome that you find in the intestine. Here, what we want to appreciate on the left is the different locations, even the GI tract, have different types of bacteria. Okay, so we can see large intestine is going to have certain types, small intestine are going to have different, some overlapping, some not, and even in different amounts, right? So we'll see that the small intestine has far less compared to something like the colon, the large intestine, where again, I mentioned that the majority of water absorption and breakdown of undigestible food is going to be taking place. Now, on the right side, we'll see all the different things that can impact our microbiome. So diet, pharmaceuticals, types of drugs someone's taking, geography, where you are in the world, okay? Your age, your birthing process, how you were fed, breastfeeding versus bottle fed, stress, exercise levels, all of this appears to impact the gut microbiome. So this is why it's getting so much attention. Okay, notice here the timestamp, if you can see the resolution on this is 2015. This is from a review going over just what we've learned recent years. And so I just want to hit home the importance that this is a very new and cutting edge field of research. But just look how far reaching this is. I mean, the microbiome, there's a reason people are excited about it, because it could be far reaching and how it could be used to potentially treat diseases. So shifting gears and going in closer to inflammatory bowel diseases, let's talk about just how these bacteria and why these bacteria can be such a nuisance. So here, let's say we have a bacterium that's winning out, and it's able to just sort of be free floating in the intestinal lumen, and then it gets to this outer mucosal layer. Even further, it gets in the inner mucosal layer, and notice that we have some defensins, these alpha defensins, that are sort of working to get these guys to stay away, a sort of first line defense to keep the bacteria out. We don't want it in this inner mucous layer really, especially if it's not beneficial. But then we'll see that every once in a while, maybe it's going to get through, okay? And so what can happen here is that once these guys get through and they damage some of these epithelial cells, then we have the activation of the immune system. And the immune system is going to activate in an effort to try to target these guys and target the bacteria for degradation and hopefully get rid of it and ruin the efforts of that bacteria to make a home inside your intestines. We're going to try to balance and have a normal microbiota so that we have these good bacteria that we can see here in green and blue, and keep the pathogenic bacteria at bay and just keep that in the lumen so it keeps moving on and can't make a home. However, on the right side, we'll now see that due to host genetic factors or environmental factors, we're now going to alter that microbiome. So I just got done telling you guys that something as simple as diet and exercise can impact this. So that's what we mean by these environmental factors. But likewise, we can have host genetic factors, an overactive immune system that maybe now reacts to um, more sensitively to the pathogenic bacteria, or maybe even some hypothesize to some of the good bacteria that it shouldn't be so sensitive about. But nonetheless, what happens on this side where we have IBD is that we have a strong activation of our immune system, most likely by some pathogenic bacteria that's able to get in and really turn on all that inflammation. And what happens here is this is going to become chronic because now if this bacteria has made a home in the intestine, then it's going to be able to just continuously trigger this inflammatory pathway. All right, so now what I want to do is just quickly review some differences, but really primarily similarities between Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis and why these two are grouped under the IBD category. So we'll see here that for Crohn's disease, this is one of the differences between ulcerative colitis. So Crohn's disease, we have diarrhea, cramping, and pain in abdomen, as well as weight loss. Whereas over here for ulcerative colitis, we're going to see that we have these urgent bowel movements, a tiredness, nausea, loss of appetite, weight loss, fever, anemia. And so while there's obviously some overlap, we can see that there's also some slight differences. But down here, we'll see that as far as the NIH goes and reporting on statistics goes, it seems like they're really lumping IBD together. And so in 2015, which was one of the most recent um, reliable statistical sources I could find, you'll see that about 1.3% of the US adult population had this. So that's about 3 million people. And it's worth noting, because I mentioned this earlier, that the incidence of IBD has increased with time. We've seen about 1 million people added to this for between 1999 and 2015. So that is actually a cause for concern that maybe Western diet or something about the environment here could be increasing the rate of IBD. We'll also see here that the ages, where there's some contradictory reporting here, as you see below. But for Crohn's disease, it seems to be more commonly diagnosed between 20 and 29, and you have a much higher chance of getting it if another family member has it or if you smoke cigarettes. And then over here for ulcerative colitis, we can see that between the ages of 15 and 30, it's usually diagnosed, and people who are older than 60. So there's a little bit of a gap there. But then also, if family members have it, and if you're Jewish, you actually have a higher risk. So this does speak to a genetic predisposition there. And so then we'll see that for the demographics of IBD in general, and this is what I was kind of saying is a little contradictory. You'll see that just overall, people who are diagnosed with IBD general, we see are more likely to be over the age of 45, Hispanic or non-Hispanic white. They have less than a high school education, and they're not employed, impoverished, and they were most likely born in the U.S. So we'll see here there's definitely some socioeconomic issues, right? So that could speak to the access to quality food, maybe as far as education goes, just a sort of general understanding of nutrition and diet. So we'll see that there's very strong environmental effects, and also this idea that just simply being born in the USA increases those chances. So this is really a cause for concern in further research to better understand why IBD has such a high rate in those demographics. But we also see that there must be a genetic component, but we could also argue that this, Hispanic, non-Hispanic white could have something to do with the demographics of America as well. All right, so the causes of these two diseases, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, are not definitive. We really need to do a lot more research, so please, take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, with the exception of some of this. So we definitely know that there's an autoimmune component with Crohn's disease. That's where this bacteria viral theory comes from. There are viruses that can make it to your intestines, but essentially the idea is that these guys can get in there and then overactivate or trigger autoimmune disorder and have your body turn on itself. The other one is genetics. There are very well-known genes that are linked to either Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. And then we'll see in Crohn's disease we have this possible, and I've italicized this because it was pretty clear on NIH's site that they didn't seem to want to associate this as strongly with Crohn's disease, as they were very quick to associate it with ulcerative colitis. These same things, stress, foods. So you see over here that they're saying these are possible, but much more likely for ulcerative colitis. So that was another difference that was found that I think is worth noting. And I think that when we look at some of the endoscopies or images from the lumen of the intestine, we can also see that Crohn's disease seems to be much worse, right? So Crohn's disease, we have these really large polypoids, or these polypoid lesions are also known as just inflammatory polyps. And here we're actually also seeing cancer. So, in fact, if you have this sort of chronic inflammation is associated with cancer. So, first we'll see here a healthy one, a healthy lumen of an intestine, and we can see that we can see vasculature, we can see the epithelium, and there's no signs of cancer here. Whereas in this one, we can see this dysplasia sort of taking form, some of this cancer cell that is going to be low grade, and we also see this ulcerative colitis, this rashing. And then we can see over here on the bottom ulcerative colitis with high grade dysplasia. So this high grade dysplasia we'll see is in the form of these red spots. Now over here to the right, we can see polypoid lesions, and then we can also see a high-grade dysplasia in patients with Crohn's disease. And now we can see that is readily apparent in this lumen. All right, so as far as treatments go, there is no cure for IBD. In fact, the focus is on remission and reducing symptoms. All right. So what we're going to do here for medicines are using anything that can control inflammation. So we can see here three different ones. A popular one that we've even discussed before, corticosteroids. So they're going to be really good drugs for regulating our immune system. But what I've shown down here is a really exciting and new type of drug. It's called a biologic. And so these biologics are really hot on the scene in the pharmaceutical industry. And essentially what they are is they're large proteins. In fact, in this case, they're actually antibodies. So we can get anti-TNF alpha antibodies. So as I showed you guys earlier, and I made a point to highlight TNF alpha, this is one of the proteins involved in the signaling pathway of the immune response. So it makes sense that if we were able to target this protein with an antibody and knock it out of the way, and get it to just sort of be non-functional, because it is a secreted protein, so it's on the outside of the cell, so it would be able to bind with an antibody. That's exactly what we see going on right here in this example. In fact, this is adalimumab. Yeah, I butchered that. Also known as Humira. Okay, so maybe you've heard of that or seen a commercial on TV. It's for rheumatoid arthritis, but essentially what this is it's going to cut down inflammation, and so it's going to bind TNF alpha so that it can't interact with this receptor and lead to genetic transcription, which will turn on inflammatory pathways. And we can see here that there's a whole slew of different types of proteins that we could be targeting that are either distinct to Crohn's disease or distinct to ulcerative colitis or overlap and are found in both. So we could have something that could almost be a universal biologic to treat both. That would be quite the goal there, or dream of researchers. But this is definitely early in research, but I bring it up because I do believe there's a lot of hope here, and so do many other researchers. Another approach to this would be a bowel rest. In fact, we've talked about this. We read about this during diabetes and how this is actually being looked at as a very serious treatment for diabetes. Essentially, intermittent fasting or very strong caloric restriction. That's because we were trying to help alleviate the pressures of the sugar imbalance as a result of diabetes. But in this case, what we're doing for the bowel rest or by fasting is we're now giving our intestines a break. Okay, we're not going to have any sort of absorption going on. We're not going to be passing food through. And so this is a good opportunity to maybe reset the microbiome in the intestine. And so what can happen here is you can fast by just not eating or drinking anything. Maybe you'll be limited to just a nutrient drink, so almost like a liquid diet. Sometimes if this is really severe and it's something that needs to be done immediately, they can actually put you on a feeding tube for a nutrient mix, or even IV nutrition. So they'll just intravenous injection. So yes, here is another meme. IBS, IBD, Crohn's can't affect me if I don't eat anything. So yeah, pretty quick thinking there. And this is actually something that they're aiming to do. And in fact, this will be one of the articles that you guys will talk about. All right, and so I had mentioned earlier that a lot of people get surgery who have IBD, and here it is. Here we can see that 60% of people had surgery within 20 years of a Crohn's disease diagnosis. That's awful. That's really unfortunate. This is going to aim to treat these things called fistulas, which are fusions of tissue, bleeding, and intestinal obstruction. And so one thing we can do is a small bowel resection, which is to remove part of the small intestine. So again, if we have some sort of intestinal blockage, if the inflammation is so bad that maybe part of the intestines now it's blocked, things can't pass through easily. What can happen is we can resect that, so they can cut away the part that's really messed up and inflamed and blocked, and then reconnect it, refuse it. So now the lumen is once again whole, and you now can have passage of material through the intestine again. So pretty major surgery there. They're essentially shortening your intestine. Not something you would want to have happen, but it is something that can be done. Another thing that maybe people have heard of is a colostomy bag. Essentially, what you're doing now is if you have a very, very diseased portion of the colon, you have to cut it away. And because you have to cut away so much of it, you can't reconnect them. So what ends up happening is now it's going to exit somewhere on your abdomen into a bag. So now this is how you would excrete your waste, which obviously would be pretty awful and not something anyone would want to have happen to them. And then another one is this resection where you can then rejoin, where essentially if you were to cut here and here, and there's enough room and you're able to join these two ends, then you could rejoin them. And so now you've gotten rid of, in this case, cancer or, cancer and IBD inflamed tissue. So yeah, these are some of the surgeries that can be done, have been done, and like I said, it's actually a lot more common um, than I'm sure these patients would like it to be who have Crohn's disease. All right, so that brings us to the end of the lecture. We're almost at an hour now, so we're going to wrap this up. You guys will see here that I would just like you to read or listen to these two articles, and then just write one page for each. So here we see fasting mimicking diet modulates microbiota and promotes intestinal regeneration to reduce inflammatory bowel disease pathology. And then second, we see what is fecal transplant. So this is a sciencey article, very sciencey article. They're all sciencey articles. What I mean by this is primary literature again. So this is going to be one of those tough papers. So what I want you guys to do is please just focus on the introduction, discussion section, and be able to just discuss those figures. So just imagine if you were going to try to explain the paper to a friend or a family member, try to do so with a general understanding. What are the figures saying? What's the main message of the paper? And do you feel convinced that they've shown that microbiota and this fast mimicking diet are somehow reducing inflammatory bowel disease pathology? And then second, what is fecal transplant? So I brought this up. It sounds pretty bizarre. It usually gets some chuckles from the crowd when we have this in the classroom. However, it's a very, very, very interesting line of research. And so what I have here is a Scientific American podcast from a woman who is actually talking about the C. diff and how C. diff infection can be treated with this fecal transplant. But so what I want you guys to do is listen to this, and then in your one-page review, talk about how you think this could also be used to treat IBD. All right, so that's it. Thank you guys for your attention, and I look forward to making another video for you guys next time.